This happened back when I was in high school, and let me tell you, it's a tale I won't ever forget. It was a crisp, autumn morning, the kind that makes you feel alive as you breathe in the cool, fresh air. Our school had organized a field trip to the Silverwood Manor, an old mansion that was rumored to be haunted. Now, you might think that high schoolers are too old for ghost stories, but trust me, curiosity got the best of us. We piled into the school bus, excitement buzzing in the air. The bus ride itself was already an adventure, with everyone sharing spooky stories and daring one another to spend the night in the mansion. As we arrived at the manor, the sight was breathtaking. The mansion stood tall, its paint peeling and windows cracked, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to engulf the entire place. Our teacher, Mr. Thompson, a stout man with a penchant for dramatics, welcomed us with a sly grin. He gave us a brief history of the mansion, how it was built in the 1800s by a wealthy family, only to fall into disrepair after a series of unfortunate events. Of course, he didn't shy away from the ghostly tales that had been whispered for generations. The plan was simple, a guided tour through the mansion, followed by a picnic lunch on the grounds. The tour guide, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Davenport, had an eerie air about her that seemed fitting for the setting. She led us through the grand entrance, where a sense of heaviness settled over us, like the weight of history bearing down on our shoulders. As we wandered through the dimly lit hallways, Mrs. Davenport regaled us with stories of unexplained footsteps, fleeting shadows, and ghostly apparitions. Every creaking floorboard and flickering light sent shivers down our spines. I remember my friend Sarah clutching my arm, her knuckles turning white, as we passed a mirror that was said to reveal the faces of those who had long departed. The mansion had a certain charm to it, even in its state of decay. Ornate chandeliers still hung from the ceiling, covered in cobwebs and dust, and faded portraits of stern-looking individuals adorned the walls. But it was the atmosphere that was truly haunting, a feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following our every move. Then came the piece de resistance, the basement. Mrs. Davenport hesitated, her usually confident demeanor wavering for a moment. She told us that this was where the most intense paranormal activity had been reported. The air grew colder as we descended the stairs, and a musty, damp smell filled our nostrils. In the dim light, we saw a series of old cells, each with rusted iron bars and decaying straw mattresses. Mrs. Davenport explained that this was where the mansion's original servants had lived, often subjected to harsh treatment by the wealthy family. I couldn't help but shudder at the thought of the suffering that must have taken place in those very cells. As we huddled together, Mrs. Davenport began to recount a particularly gruesome tale. She spoke of a young maid, Emily, who had been accused of stealing from the family. The family's punishment was cruel and unforgiving. They locked her in one of these cells, leaving her to suffer and eventually perish. Her spirit, it was said, still lingered in the basement, forever trapped in the torment she had endured. Just as Mrs. Davenport finished her story, a loud crash echoed through the basement, followed by a chilling whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Panic erupted among us, and I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. Some of the braver souls rushed toward the source of the sound, while others, including myself, were frozen in place. It turned out that a stack of old wooden crates had toppled over, creating the noise. But the feeling of unease remained, and no one was eager to linger in the basement any longer. Mrs. Davenport quickly led us back upstairs, her hands trembling slightly as she closed the door to the basement behind her. The rest of the field trip was a blur, with our picnic lunch feeling like a surreal dream. The tales we had heard had taken hold of our imaginations, and the once lively atmosphere had been replaced by a quiet unease. We didn't dare mention what had happened in the basement, as if acknowledging it would make it more real. As we boarded the bus to head back to school, I couldn't help but glance back at the Silverwood Manor, its imposing figure slowly disappearing from view. That day had left an indelible mark on all of us, a shared experience that would forever bond us in a way that words could never truly capture. So, you see, the mansion had left its mark on all of us, not just through the stories and the eerie encounters, but also through the unspoken understanding that some mysteries are best left untouched. We returned to school that day, forever changed by the secrets we had uncovered and the glimpses into a world beyond our understanding. And to this day, whenever autumn rolls around and the leaves start to fall, I can't help but remember that chilling field trip to the Silverwood Manor, a day that still haunts my memories. I remember the day we went on that ill-fated trip to the museum like it was yesterday. It was a bright and sunny morning, the kind that fills you with excitement and promise. Our class had been eagerly anticipating this trip for weeks, and finally, the day had arrived. Little did we know that it would turn into an experience none of us would ever forget. We were a group of high school students, accompanied by our history teacher, Mr. Thompson. The museum we were visiting was renowned for its extensive collection of artifacts and exhibits that spanned centuries. As we piled into the school bus, laughter and chatter filled the air. Everyone was in high spirits, looking forward to a day of exploration and learning. The bus ride was a mix of anticipation and restlessness. The excitement was palpable as we discussed the exhibits we were most excited to see. The museum had recently unveiled a new section dedicated to ancient civilizations, and that had piqued the interest of many. I remember sitting next to my friend Sarah, both of us eagerly planning out our route through the museum. Upon arrival, the museum's grand facade welcomed us, and we filed in with a sense of wonder. Mr. Thompson gathered us in the entrance hall and gave us a brief overview of the museum's layout. He emphasized the importance of staying together and following the designated path to make the most of our visit. With that, we were set loose to explore the vast corridors of history. Sarah and I started in the section dedicated to ancient Egypt. The artifacts on display were breathtaking, intricately carved statues, golden jewelry, and even a mummy case that sent shivers down my spine. The air was filled with a sense of mystery and reverence as we marveled at the remnants of a civilization long gone. As we moved from exhibit to exhibit, time seemed to slip away. We wandered through halls filled with armor and weaponry from medieval times, and then into rooms showcasing the art and culture of different eras. The museum was a treasure trove of knowledge, and we were like kids in a candy store, eager to absorb it all. But then, as we entered a dimly lit section dedicated to the history of witch trials and dark folklore, a chill ran down my spine. The atmosphere in this part of the museum was different, heavier, almost oppressive. The displays were eerie, featuring artifacts used in rituals and trials that seemed to carry an unsettling energy. Sarah and I exchanged nervous glances as we read about the gruesome methods used to determine if someone was a witch. The room was silent except for the soft shuffling of feet as visitors moved through the exhibits. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that there was something lurking in the shadows just beyond our line of sight. We quickly decided to move on, hoping that a change of scenery would dispel the unease we were feeling. We found ourselves in the section dedicated to ancient relics from far-flung cultures. The artifacts were intriguing: masks, idols, and talismans that had been used for various purposes throughout history. As we stood in front of a glass case containing a particularly ornate mask, I heard a faint whisper. I turned to Sarah, thinking she had said something, but her expression told me she hadn't. The whisper seemed to echo in my ears, growing louder and more urgent. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint its source, but the museum visitors around us seemed oblivious. My heart began to race as the whispering grew more intense. It was as though a chorus of voices was speaking in hushed tones, their words a jumble of incomprehensible sounds. Panic gripped me, and I grabbed Sarah's arm, urging her to move away from the exhibit. She must have heard it too, because her face was pale and her eyes wide with fear. We practically fled from that section of the museum, not stopping until we found ourselves in a bustling corridor filled with visitors chatting and laughing. The oppressive feeling that had enveloped us in the witch trials exhibit began to lift, and I took deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. We regrouped with our classmates, who were happily discussing their own museum experiences. I wanted to share what had happened, but something held me back. How could I explain the inexplicable whispering, the feeling of being watched, and the unshakable dread that had settled in my chest? We continued our museum exploration, trying to shake off the unsettling encounter in the previous exhibit. Our next stop was the section dedicated to ancient civilizations of the Americas. The displays featured intricate pottery, vibrant textiles, and artifacts that spoke of rich cultural histories. As we moved from exhibit to exhibit, my unease began to fade, replaced by a sense of fascination and curiosity. The stories of these ancient peoples came to life through the artifacts on display, and I found myself immersed in their worlds. One display in particular caught my attention, a beautifully crafted Mayan calendar. The intricacy of the carvings and the precision of the design were awe-inspiring. I stood there, lost in thought, imagining the civilization that had created such a masterpiece. Sarah and I decided to take a break and sat down on a bench near a large window overlooking the museum courtyard. The sunlight streamed in, casting a warm glow on the surroundings. We chatted about the exhibits we had seen and shared a few laughs, feeling a renewed sense of excitement about the rest of our museum adventure. As we sat there, I noticed a peculiar figure in the courtyard below. It was a man, dressed in what appeared to be outdated clothing, a long coat and a top hat. He stood alone, staring up at the museum building. What struck me as odd was that he seemed out of place, as though he had stepped out of a different time. I nudged Sarah and pointed out the man. She looked down and shrugged, dismissing it as someone dressed in historical attire as part of a museum event. But something about his demeanor gave me pause. His gaze was fixed on the museum with an intensity that seemed almost longing. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the man, and an inexplicable feeling tugged at my instincts. Without thinking, I stood up and headed toward the staircase that led down to the courtyard. Sarah called after me, but I was already on a mission to find out more about this mysterious figure. As I descended the staircase, a sense of determination fueled my steps. I needed to know who this man was and why he seemed so transfixed by the museum. When I reached the courtyard, I looked around, but the man was nowhere to be seen. Confused, I walked further into the courtyard, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of him. It was then that I noticed an open doorway leading to a narrow corridor. My curiosity got the better of me, and I entered the corridor, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man. The corridor was dimly lit and lined with smaller exhibits that seemed to focus on lesser-known historical periods. As I walked deeper into the corridor, the air grew cooler, and a sense of unease returned. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was allowing my earlier experience to influence my perception. But then I heard it, faint footsteps echoing in the corridor ahead. My heart raced as I followed the sound, my footsteps mingling with the others. The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, and a feeling of disorientation washed over me. Finally, I reached a small alcove at the end of the corridor. And there he was, the man in the top hat. He stood before an exhibit that depicted a scene from a bygone era. His gaze was fixed on a painting that portrayed a bustling city street, horses and carriages passing by. I hesitated, unsure of how to approach him. But before I could say anything, he turned to me, his eyes meeting mine. There was a depth of sadness in his gaze, a longing that tugged at my heartstrings. I mustered the courage to speak. "Excuse me, sir. Are you a part of the museum staff?" I asked tentatively. He shook his head, his voice soft yet filled with emotion. "No, my dear. I'm not of this time. I'm but a spectator, an observer of history." I blinked in disbelief, trying to make sense of his words. "What do you mean, not of this time?" He sighed, his gaze returning to the painting before him. I once walked these streets, lived in this city. But that was long ago, in a time that has faded into the pages of history. I come here to remember, to relive moments from a life that was. My mind raced, attempting to comprehend the impossibility of the situation. You're saying you're a ghost? He nodded, a faint smile gracing his lips. In a manner of speaking, yes. I'm bound to this place, to the memories it holds. The museum is a gateway for me, a way to reconnect with the world I knew. I was both captivated and unnerved by his words. The man's presence felt surreal, like a fragment of a story that had been torn from the pages of time. As we spoke, he shared stories of his life in the past, of love and loss, of moments that had shaped him. The encounter felt like a dream, a meeting between two worlds that should never have intersected. Yet there I was, standing face to face with a ghost from another era. Eventually, our conversation came to an end, and the man in the top hat turned his gaze back to the painting. I must go now, my dear. My time here is limited, and I must return to the shadows of history, he said softly. I watched as he faded away, his form becoming ethereal before vanishing completely. A mixture of wonder and sadness filled my heart as I stood alone in the alcove. When I returned to the courtyard, Sarah was waiting for me, her eyes wide with curiosity. I recounted my encounter with the ghostly figure, and she listened with a mixture of amazement and disbelief. That's incredible, she whispered. To think that the museum is a bridge between the past and the present. As we rejoined our classmates and made our way back to the bus, I couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary experience I had just witnessed. Our field trip to the museum had taken an unexpected turn, unveiling a connection to history that transcended the boundaries of time. The memory of the man in the top hat remains etched in my mind, a reminder that the past is never truly lost. It lives on in the stories we tell, the artifacts we preserve, and the echoes that linger in the corridors of time. And as I looked out at the museum one last time, I knew that its walls held secrets and mysteries that went beyond what the eye could see, waiting to be discovered by those who dared to venture into its depths.